This presentation on Richard Nixon, the Rise and Fall, created by MelissaPharm. So an overview of the unit. This is for an 11th grade United States History 2 course. It includes differentiation, which assists students with a wide array of learning levels and learning strategies. So this lesson could most likely be taught in a 2 to 3 week period, depending on the level of the students and the level of engagement. If this was a lower course with, for example, more ELL students or more students with disabilities that really impact their learning, this may take longer. It begins at the beginning of Nixon's presidency and ends with Ford pardoning Nixon of criminal charges. The lesson includes original learning tools, low-tech learning tools, graphic organizers, and also high-tech learning tools, innovative tools, and found learning tools. So the standards that this lesson will go over is the US 2.28. So analyze the important domestic policies and events that took place during the presidencies of President Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Primarily, we're focusing on Nixon within this unit. So we will look at D, Nixon's appeal to the silent majority, E, the anti-war and countercultural movements, F, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and G, the Watergate scandal. So this is Lesson 1. Lesson 1 will be the first one in the unit. It will transition from Johnson into Nixon. The lesson includes original learning tool, low-tech tools, and graphic organize. So Lesson 1 looks at the standard of the domestic policies of Nixon and his appeal to the silent majority. The objective is that students will be able to verbally discuss the successes and failures of Nixon's domestic policies. The lesson opening. On the board, there will be directions that prompt students to complete the do now. Once all the students are seated, I will verbally explain the do now. The do now will ask students to make a list of all that they know or think that they may know about Richard Nixon. When the students are done with their list, they should share it with a partner, and then I will lead in creating a master list on the board. So I thought that it was very important to explain that it's not necessarily what you do know, but it could be what you think you know, because you don't want to discourage maybe shy about their facts and what they know about history. So the teacher input. After I read the agenda and objectives, the students will watch 3 of Nixon's campaign commercials from 1968. Students will be asked to jot down notes regarding his messages, values, and audience. After the campaign videos, students will discuss their notes with their neighbor. After a few minutes, I will lead in debriefing the class and transitioning into Nixon's domestic policies and goals for the nation in his first term in presidency. So I thought this was a cool way to get students familiar with Nixon. They're looking at his campaign videos from before he was president, and then they kind of guess what they think that his goals would have been. So it's interesting to start the unit with even before he was president and what his goals were, and to see how he kind of strayed from those, or didn't stray from his campaign commercials. So I also this because these campaign commercials have captions, if you can find those specific ones. And so this is auditory and visual alternatives. This will help students who either have a visual impairment or auditory impairment. So the students will be working with a PowerPoint and an accompanying note sheet. I will teach the students some of Nixon's domestic policies throughout the PowerPoint. The students should take notes in the space provided on the note sheet. Within the PowerPoint, students will also be prompted to discuss various topics or make hypotheses about the topic. So these note sheets can be used depending on the level of your students. If this is a more advanced class, the note sheet does not necessarily need to be used, and the PowerPoint could definitely eliminate some of the vocabulary and images. So this is an example of what the PowerPoint could look like for maybe a lower level or average class. So New Federalism was one of his major things, and it gives a definition, and it also allows students to turn and talk. So they are communicating with their peers, kind of working through their ideas, working through what they're learning. And so it's defining terms and using symbols. So I used a symbol of the state as a whole and then their city also. This is an example of the note sheet. So this is how I like to set up their note sheet because it gives them kind of a heading of what they should be writing down. This is the topic that we're on at the moment. And then it kind of gives them bullets, and you can add as many bullets as you want for how many points you think that they should be writing down. I think that this is a good way that students are able to really organize their thoughts. So it's scaffolded practice. It does not need to be used for a more advanced class, but it also allows them to manage the information and their learning. So guided practice. Students will read and annotate an excerpt from Nixon's silent majority speech. Once they are finished, they will discuss with their neighbor what they believe the silent majority is. I will lead in debriefing the whole class and discussing Nixon's hopes for the war in Vietnam. So this is really cool because, as you can see here with the speech, it's just an excerpt, so it's not as daunting. Kids kind of get nervous sometimes, but it's just an excerpt, and it also above it gives a little bit of background in the italics. And so students really, when I had used this, they really responded well to the shorter version, and it's the portion of the speech that really explains what the silent majority is in a way that's understandable for students. So extended practice. Students will be asked, overall, do you think Nixon's domestic policies were a success or a failure? Based on Nixon's commercials, do you feel he stayed true to his beliefs? I will ask one question at a time, and students will either go to the designated disagree or agree side of the room. Students will then discuss their reasoning. So this is a chance to get students up and moving, which in a high school classroom is definitely a necessity. So this way they're drawing on what they did in the beginning of the lesson, so with the commercials, and they're also kind of thinking about how they feel about politics, how they feel about the government, how they feel about Nixon, kind of relating their own beliefs. It also fosters collaboration and communication. Students are getting up, they're moving, they're talking to their peers, they're letting their voice be heard, they're listening to others. It's a really good way to engage the whole class. So further extended practice. Students will analyze a political cartoon critiquing Nixon's domestic policies and then create their own based on how they feel about his policies. So the students will look at a political cartoon that shows kind of getting rid of the great society that Johnson had set up. So it's critiquing it in a way where Nixon is kind of a bad guy. So the students need to look at how they feel about the policies. Do they agree with what he's doing? Do they not agree? And kind of make a political cartoon based on their thoughts. So this would be a rubric. So rubrics are very important to me, definitely as a teacher, because I think that it really gives students an idea of the expectations that are created for them. So I would give them this rubric, and they would create their political cartoon. Obviously, the teacher, or if there's a para in the class, someone should be rotating to make sure that students are understanding what they're doing. They can help them kind of gather their ideas and stay on track. Lesson closing. The students will wrap up their lesson by discussing the following questions. What did you learn today? What is still confusing? What did you find most interesting? I will answer any questions the students may have. So this is definitely an important part of the lesson because it makes sure that everyone's on the same page. Although not students got the same thing out of the lesson, the majority of the class should definitely understand what was being said. So this is a chance to answer any questions, see the students that still seem a little wary, and this is the point when you can figure out if you want to make this a 2-day lesson, if you want to jump right into the next topic the next day. This is the point where you can kind of slow things down or speed things up. So possible learning barriers. So after creating this lesson, I reflected on the lesson and created these, what I think could be possible learning barriers. So students with a visual impairment may have trouble seeing the smartboard or reading the printed handouts. Students with an attention disorder may have trouble staying on task during the several changes in activities. Students with a hearing impairment may have trouble hearing the videos, lecture, or discussion. And students may be confused with some of the government terminology. So these were the solutions, and these are things that I would definitely add to the lesson once I taught it. So the teacher must be sure that the students with visual disability are seated close to the board and have printed handouts with a larger font size. So this could be a printout of the PowerPoint, a printout of the speech in a larger font, just making sure whatever the student needs, it's accommodated. So teacher must be sure that transitions are quick and directions are easy to follow. Teacher must hand out a copy of the transcript of the commercials, copy of the PowerPoint lecture, and jot down some discussion responses on the board. Teacher must do several verbal or written check-ins throughout the lecture to be sure that students are comprehending the material. So this is to be taught in an 84-minute class. So this is kind of a double block. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of information being thrown at them. This is definitely a new topic for a lot of them. So it's definitely important that those check-ins are being met. So finally, at the end of the lesson, so since this is day 1, you would introduce the unit project. All of my units have an overarching project. This is the project for the Nixon unit. So students are to analyze President Nixon's actions during his 2-term presidency. Did he deserve to be reelected, or should he have been forgiven of his role in Watergate and been reelected, or should Nixon have not been reelected and was Ford the better choice? So this kind of giving it to them in the beginning of the unit allows them personal goal setting. So I need to have this done by this date, this done by this date, it's due on this date. And it also gives students expectations of what's to be met during the whole unit. So students will create a well-developed and detailed campaign to elect Nixon or another president. So this is kind of the point where I give students options. So they can present this in a PowerPoint, in a video. It's somehow their campaign manager, and they need to figure out how they will best get their ideas across. It definitely needs to be well developed because they do have the whole unit to work on this. And they should be able to follow all the directions, and a more detailed rubric and checklist will become further in the unit. 2. This lesson includes found learning tool, low-tech learning tool, and many other graphic organizers and skills. So we are working on the anti-war and countercultural movements part of the standard. The objective is that students will be able to verbally discuss the pros and cons of Nixon's decision to end the Vietnam War. As a do now, students will share their political cartoon with their peers. Students will be able to see the different interpretations and understandings of the material from the previous day. So students will share those political cartoons that they were doing yesterday. They were to finish them for homework if they hadn't finished them in class. And students will be able to see how they interpreted Nixon's domestic policies. I'm sure some students will think that they were necessary. Some students will think that he was horrible from the get-go. So, teacher input. Using a PowerPoint and an accompanying note sheet, like the one that we saw in Lesson 1, I will explain the heightened fear in America caused by the Vietnam War. So, the Vietnam War has already been covered. We know about the fear that the Vietnam War was in America, but this will definitely be a time where I will refresh students on what was happening. After explaining the draft riots, protests, deaths, and other aspects of the war and Nixon's involvement, I will prompt students to discuss the following questions in small groups. If you were Nixon, what would you have done? At what point is being the police officer of the world too big of a job for the most powerful nation? Do you notice any connections to current day issues? So this is really connecting the big ideas. So this is what we like to call in history real-world connections. We're looking at the overarching themes of the U.S. too as a whole, America being the police officer. What role does that play in U.S. politics? When is it necessary to put the nation as a whole first? And how can you connect this to current day issues? So this is a way for students to really reflect on what they hear in the news, kind of get up to date on that, and connect it to what they're learning in class so that they don't think that this is just history. We are actually living this again. Extended practice. Students will create a brochure in either supporting the end of the war or calling for more action to be done to fight communism. Students should draw on factual material from the previous chapters to support their argument. So this is a found learning tool. A teacher at my district used this, and they actually were very incredible, and students really were engaged in this project. So the brochure can be either on the computer as computer made, like a template, or it can be handwritten. And students are to take the information that they're learning and figure out whether they think that the war should end or if they think that America has more to do in Vietnam. The lesson closing, students will share their brochures and lead in a discussion debating the decision to end the war. This discussion should show students how difficult of a decision it was for the presidents to make. So many presidents were faced with how to end a war, when to end a war, when enough was enough. And students will definitely have differing opinions within their brochures, and this will be an interesting time for students to see that it's not just cut and dry, it's a very difficult decision. So they're kind of putting they're walking in someone else's shoes, so they're being able to see life from a different perspective, and that perspective being the president. So possible learning barriers. Students with visual impairment may have trouble seeing the smartboard or reading the printed handouts. Students with an attention disorder may have trouble staying on task during the several changes in activities. Students with a memory issue may have trouble recalling the background of the Vietnam War previous chapter. And students may be uncomfortable sharing their political cartoon or brochure. So teacher must be sure that students with visual disability are seated close to the board and have printed handouts. I know I talked about this, but this is an issue in many classrooms, and teachers need to be aware of why students may be off task, why students may not be responding to what you're saying. So teachers really need to be sure that they're doing what they need to do for the student. So transition should be quick and direction should be easy to follow. Teachers should assess the level of understanding by asking questions. If students seem confused, the teacher should go through the Vietnam War PowerPoint or refresh the students with a quick question and answer session. Teachers should provide the option of having students hand in a written explanation of their projects. I know that many teachers do this already. Some students are very shy and you don't get the idea that they are understanding the material, but really if it is done in a written format, they can show you that they really do understand the material. So on to lesson 3. This is not lesson 3 in the unit. This would definitely be towards the end of the unit, but for me explaining this in terms of this unit, we're going to call it lesson 3. So this includes a high-tech tool and an innovative learning tool. So lesson 3 is looking at the Watergate scandal and the Supreme Court case U.S. versus Nixon. The objective is for students to be able to verbally discuss President Ford's decision to pardon Nixon through primary text analysis and argumentative discussions. So this is a lesson that will definitely get heated and will definitely be engaging for all students. So on the board, there will be directions that prompt students to complete the do now. Once all students are seated, I will also verbally explain the do now. Students will take out a sheet of paper and in small groups they must compile as many facts as they know about the Watergate scandal. Each student in the group must come up with at least one fact. After 2 minutes, I will compile a master list on the board as a review. So students have already learned a little bit about Watergate. Some of it may be things that they know from the news or from media or from movies. And it's kind of like a race. So this is kind of incentive for students to really think about what they know. And a lot of kids in high school love the competition aspect of class. So throwing this in there is a fun way to make class interesting from the get-go. So teacher input. Quickly review Nixon's presidency and the Watergate scandal. Again, they should have already talked about a lot of this, but it's a review. Students will annotate Ford's speech regarding Nixon's pardon while also listening and watching the speech on the smartboard. Students should jot down some notes on their paper, but also notice the body language and mechanisms used by Ford to convey his message. So this is good for people with auditory or visual disabilities. So they are seeing it, they're hearing it, they're reading it on their paper. It's really coming at them at many different ways. So it's engaging for all students no matter the disability. After the video, I will give students a moment to jot down any final notes. Then I will lead them in a class discussion on the following questions. Do you think this speech helped or hardened the effort to restore trust in the presidency? What criteria do citizens generally employ to decide if they trust a politician? Did you notice any of these in the video? Do you think the president should have the power to issue a pardon? Should the president have powers above the average citizen? And again, bringing in real-world connections. This could be like the NSA, reading people's text messages. Do they think that's fair? So this is definitely a lesson that will be engaging. Students always have a lot to say, and the teacher just needs to make sure that they're relating it back to the history of it. So extended practice. Students will be given the USA Today article, Watergate Scandal Changed the Political Landscape Forever. They will quietly read and annotate this article. Once finished, they will discuss the article in their groups, while also discussing the following questions. Did the Watergate scandal permanently damage citizens' sense of trust in the executive office or even in government positions in general? They should use evidence from the USA Today article or present-day examples. After about 10 minutes, students will share their ideas with the whole class. Further extended practice. Students will be given directions to begin a project that will last 1 or 2 days, and this also depends on the level of the students. They will have 2 options. Option 1, individually script and film a news report using webcams on the Chromebook laptops. They will discuss the diminishing love for Nixon and the controversial acts of Ford while using specific evidence from history. So this is an original learning tool that I had created, and it's also a high-tech tool and an innovative learning tool. So depending on what your school has, my school has Chromebooks, so we would be able to do this project on Chromebooks with the webcams. It depends on what sources you have to be able to make this a high-tech learning tool. Option 2 is more low-tech, so they could individually create a 3-page newspaper with illustrations. They will discuss the diminishing love for Nixon and the controversial acts of Ford while using specific examples from history. So the directions are the same, but the outlet in which they want to express their ideas could be different. So this is definitely an in-class project, probably some at home, but it would last a few days. So the lesson closing. I will put the Gallup poll of Ford's approval rating on the board for students to analyze. Students will be asked to write a few descriptive sentences answering the following question. Do you think Ford made the best decision in the long run? So you must use the Gallup poll and one other piece of evidence from today's lesson, which would be the article, discussions, Ford's speech, or anything else that was said. So they're looking at this poll, they're analyzing graphs, they're using their critical thinking skills. This is really a good way to tie in everything that was done that day in a way that really allows students to reflect. And this is the poll that they would be looking at. This is a real poll from the Gallup. So possible learning barriers. Students with a visual impairment may not be able to participate in analyzing the body language of Ford during his speech. Students should have an opportunity to show their understanding of Nixon's trial. Some students may be shy and feel uncomfortable participating in the discussion. Students that are struggling readers may have trouble finishing the article in the allotted time. So possible solutions. Teacher must make sure that students describe Ford's body language to be sure that students with visual impairments are able to truly participate and engage in this portion of the lesson. After the Watergate scandal and Nixon review, there should be some sort of informal assessment to be sure that students understand the background material. If students do not understand this portion of the lesson, they will be lost throughout the rest of the lesson. So it's really crucial that they understand what is being said. Students should have an opportunity to write their responses down before sharing them with the class. This may take some stress off the shy students. So even just giving them a minute, telling them to jot down their ideas and that you're going to call on someone. A student should read the article aloud. Then students can individually go back and annotate pieces that they found important. This unit as a whole. So it allowed students to reflect on the past and relate it to the present. So it really allowed them to make those real-world connections. It allowed students to use critical thinking skills at their own pace. So, for example, the unit project, it was a personal pace. It allowed students to communicate ideas with others. So they were really collaborating with others, bouncing ideas back and forth, hearing others' interpretations. Understand how the United States played a role in the whole world. Analyze speeches, videos, graphs, and articles, and engagement was fostered by student creativity with high-tech and low-tech projects. And most importantly, it presented information in a way that was accessible for all students, which is definitely the goal of being a teacher. Thank you all for listening, and I hope this was helpful.